I'd like to hand over to Daniel Morgan Thomas to introduce our speaker today. Daniel.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and hello to people who've come in since Lee started giving the preliminaries. It's lovely to see you all here this afternoon. Someone else come off mute there. We're delighted to be able to offer you this presentation on the Willesden Jewish Cemetery, which is Willesden, London, in case there are any others around the world we're not aware of. But it's great to have people from all over the country and indeed the world joining us today. Some of you might be aware we were able to offer an in-person group tour of Willesden Cemetery in August, which was the first in-person event we've done as a society for many months this summer, which was exciting. But we were aware it's not as accessible for those of you who aren't in London or indeed this country. So we're really excited to be able to offer a virtual tour this afternoon, courtesy of Liz Manuel, who's going to give us our talk. So I will, if she's ready, hand over to Liz to welcome her for JGSGB this afternoon. Welcome, Liz. Oh, and can you unmute yourself?
Am I? Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me along this afternoon. Willesden Jewish Cemetery, uncovering buried history. So I am a volunteer guide at Willesden and have been for the last year and a half. I just, and it's already come up in the conversation that started when we first started the call, I'm personally very interested in it. I grew up very, very nearby, and all of my 4 grandparents are buried in Willesden Jewish Cemetery, and I know various people have mentioned that they have grandparents and other relatives buried there. So that's my personal intro into it, if you like. 3.5 years ago, through a lottery funding grant, the cemetery was able to look at ways of protecting it, enhancing it, and opening it up to the public, and making it a house of life, and that's how we like to refer to it. What I'm going to do this afternoon, in not a huge amount of time, is take you through something about the background of the cemetery, and some of the main features of it, and then introduce you to some of the residents, as we like to call them, who are buried at the cemetery. This is by way of slide presentation, and my first slide is now not coming up. Whoops. Let's just see what's happening here. Okay, there we go. That's a drone view, an overview. Cemetery was opened in 1873, and we're looking, if you're familiar, and I know some of you will be familiar with it, we're looking down at the prayer hall. The bulk of the cemetery is behind the prayer hall. At the front, I hope, can you see my cursor moving? This is what we call the front lawns. And at the very back there is there's actually a gate which is open when the cemetery is open, which goes through to the Liberal Jewish Cemetery, which joins it. And if you're familiar with the Willesden area, this is Gladstone Park Roundwood Park at the back. So as I say, the cemetery was opened in 1873. It's on 12 acres of land. At the beginning, only about 5 acres were used. And it was sheep grazing land, which was owned by All Souls College, Oxford. And that's how the land was used. Willesden at the time was a village, and there was no Jewish community there, although in the into the 20th century there was a very vibrant Jewish community, and there is now a resurgent Jewish community in the area. Certainly through the 20s, 30s, 40s, and well into the 1970s, Willesden was a vibrant Jewish community. But at the time when the cemetery was opened, there was no local Jewish community. The Jewish community in London at that time was based in the East End and then into the West End. This is the avenue of trees behind the prayer house. And so you can see that it was beautifully laid out, and it was laid out as a garden cemetery. And this was a Victorian idea. Garden cemeteries became popular during Victorian times, and some of you may be familiar with some of the London garden cemeteries, most famously Highgate Cemetery, but also Kensal Green, Brompton, and Norwood, and others. And Willesden is sometimes referred to as the 8th garden cemetery. And at the time, there were once upon a time there were 25 gardeners there. These days we have about 4 or 5 volunteer gardeners who come to help with the various projects that are going on. So it was very beautifully laid out, and this avenue of trees is still there. So as I say, some of you may be familiar with it behind the main buildings. historically, there were not specific burial grounds, but there were burial grounds in the East End where the Jewish community buried their dead. But the idea in the non-Jewish world of having specific burial grounds was copied by the Jewish community. Churchyards were usually used as burial grounds, and it then became, these garden cemeteries became the sort of the popular way in Victorian times. So I'm going to show you this main building. This is the prayer hall, and as you can see from the slide, this was designed by Nathan Solomon Joseph, and I believe that we've got a relative, a descendant who's on the Zoom today. He designed this main building, and then the main prayer hall, the portico in front, was added later into the 1920s. And to the side of to the side of the main building, to the left, which you can see in that shot, is on this slide, is the room used by the priests, because in Jewish tradition, priests, the Kohanim, the priests, don't go near the body, so they have a separate space to be. And to the right of this building is the building where the bodies are prepared for burial. It's known as the Tahara House. And these days, the funeral buildings are not used other than the prayer hall. The preparation of the body is done now at Bushey Cemetery, which is one of the main Jewish cemeteries in London, which was opened in the 1940s. I should have said at the very beginning, and I'm sorry if I didn't make this clear, this is an Orthodox Jewish cemetery and follows the traditions of the Orthodox, the main Orthodox community's practices. So that means there's burial and no cremation, no cremations take place. But just going back to these buildings, so the prayer hall is still in use, but the other buildings are not. Sometimes people who see these buildings sort of suggest, I mean, they're described as a neo-Gothic style, but sometimes people say they remind them of a Methodist chapel. I don't know, maybe we'll comment about that later on, see if people have thoughts on that. So this is looking inside the prayer hall, quite a simple building, as you can see. On the wall of the prayer hall are memorial boards, and this may be of interest to many of you. These memorial boards commemorate soldiers who died during the South African War, or known as the Boer War formerly, and also the First and Second World War. Some of them commemorate soldiers who fell in those battles. And some of these boards actually came from the Aldershot Synagogue, which was a military synagogue, well, a synagogue based in the military area of Aldershot. And when that synagogue closed, they were brought to the prayer hall at Willesden. Quite a bit of work is going on at the moment to try and trace some of the names on these boards to see if they are perhaps have relatives who are buried in Willesden, particularly maybe parents of soldiers who might have been buried subsequently in Willesden Cemetery. So that may be of interest to some of you in your genealogical work. This is the building that I referred to before, where the bodies are prepared for burial, or in the past. It's now become sort of like, you can visit it. It's more of a museum. One of the things that the lottery grant enabled enabled to happen was that the various interpretation boards and signage, and turning this into more of a museum plus a new visitor centre were able to be created. And actually the visitor centre is a great resource, and you can come and search family members there if that's something that you're interested in doing. So going back to just covering Jewish burial practices, I'm sure that many of you on this call are familiar with them, but where possible, the body is buried within 24 hours, it's constantly accompanied, it's prepared and cleansed in a special way. It's a very simple service. Everybody has the same coffin. There are generally no flowers. Oh, I just went on mute. Can you still hear me? Can somebody wave at me? Does that sound okay?
Sorry,
please carry on, Liz.
Yes, I seem to have gone on mute for a minute. Okay, just to carry on, the funeral service is led by a rabbi, but in modern times, often a family member or friend will give a eulogy, and then there's a period of mourning for 7 days usually when people visit, and then finally at the end of an 11-month period. In this country, certainly, a tombstone is consecrated on the grave. So just back to the prayer hall. The prayer hall, as I was just mentioning earlier, does have this look of a, as I say, people say it reminds them of a chapel or of a Methodist chapel. It's a listed building, and in fact, all the buildings in the cemetery are Grade 2 listed, so protected from anything being done to them. This is a view of the cemetery, just to give you sort of an idea of it. It is very, in parts of it, it's very Victorian, because obviously it was opened in 1873, and there are a lot of tombstones and iconography which are very reflective of the Victorian times. So, for example, here there's that view is of a it looks like a bit like a Greek temple, and I'm going to talk about this particular grave a bit later on. As you can see in the front, there's what looks like an urn. These were the fashion of the day, and the Jewish community of the time who were very Victorian and wanted to be seen in that, as good English people as well as good Jews, copied the styles of the Victorians, and so followed it in their burial practices as well. And here you can see they're obelisk styles, they're columns. Sometimes there'll be a column which may be cut down, which might symbolize a life that was cut short. And as well as these very Victorian looking buildings, you'll also see Jewish symbols. So these are some of the symbols you'll see on a grave, on a gravestone. On the top left there, that's hands lighting candles. It might symbolize a very pious woman. The bottom below that are hands which signify somebody of the priestly, a Cohen or priestly group. To the right, you'll see a book, again, might signify somebody who was very learned, and all these, so this is a combination of sort of Jewish iconography and the Victorian together, and Willesden really does show that. There is also at Willesden a memorial to the British Commonwealth soldiers who fell in the First and Second World Wars, and this was the first Jewish war memorial in a cemetery, opened in 1961 and designed by the main architect of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. This is at the front. Again, if you're familiar with the cemetery, this is at the front on the left as you come in. These are, again, this is another remembrance board. 60,000 Jewish people fought in the Second World War out of an Anglo-Jewish community at that time of about 400,000 people. Many of those that fell are not buried here because they may have, they may be buried in France or Belgium or where, particularly from the First World War. So these memorial boards are very important and significant. And as I say, there is this project on to try and match some of the names up. And that's another shot of the inside of the memorial boards. As well as the cemetery buildings being listed, there are 3 graves which have Grade 2 protection, Grade 2 listing. And on this slide, you can see, so the one on the far left is for Rosalind Franklin, and I'm going to talk a little bit about her a bit later on. The one in the middle is for Hannah Rosebery, who was originally Hannah Rothschild, well-known philanthropist and society hostess, political hostess. She was married to Archibald Primrose, who became Earl Rosebery and who became Prime Minister. She died relatively young, and he was heartbroken by this. And he built a mausoleum. I think if I can see my cursor, there's the design for it, but there is what's left of it. And this was based on the Taj Mahal, actually, to sort of recognize his great love for his wife, who had died in her early 40s. But actually, this is all that's left of it, because it took a direct hit during the Second World War, and most of it was destroyed. But what is left of it is, and you can see it's very ornate, what is left of it is protected with a Grade 2 listing. And the third grade that has a Grade 2 listing is the grave of Max Eberstadt, who was came from a well-connected family, originally born in Germany, but they came to England, a well-connected family, and his sister was a friend of the pre-Raphaelite artist Edward Burne-Jones. And when her brother died, she asked him to design something for his grave. And actually this grave is quite, I personally think, quite modern looking, but it has this tree motif on it. I hope on my slide it's coming up that the people are covering it, but I'm assuming that you can all see this on the slide. Thank you, Lee. And it's really sort of signifying a life cut short, I think. So these are three Grade 2 listed graves. For those of you who are not familiar, I know we've got people from the US on the call. It means they're protected and nothing can be done to them. So those are of interest. So just moving on now to, that was really a whistle-stop tour to show you what the cemetery looks like. Who's actually buried there? There's all sorts of people buried there, artists, scientists, religious leaders. And I'm just going to take you through as many as I can manage in the time. So I'm going to sort of go through a whole group of our residents. And I want to start off with Chief Rabbi Nathan Adler, who was the first sort of organizing Chief Rabbi of the United Kingdom Jewish community. He was born in Hanover. He was a very educated man, both in his religious studies and his secular studies. And he came in 1844 to be Chief Rabbi in England, and of England and the colonies at the time. And he was very aware of this balance between secular and Jewish life, and he modernized. He was a modernizer, and he was instrumental really in the introduction of a number of institutions which we still have today. He helped found Jews College, which led to the training of rabbis in this country. It's now in its successor form today, it's the London School of Jewish Studies. He was instrumental in the opening of the cemetery in 1873, and the authorized prayer book, which was and which is still in use today. He led the way for that. And the authorized prayer book was really sort of following the model of the Christian prayer book, but a modern English translation for people to use, and that's known as the Singer's Prayer Book. He was succeeded by his son Hermann Adler, who'd come with his father from Germany, but then had his rabbinical education and university education in Germany. And he succeeded his father, and they are both buried on the very sort of that arch of trees that I showed you at the beginning. They're buried on that sort of on the front row there, if you like. But directly opposite them is this man. Oh, sorry, let's go back a minute. Is Simeon Singer. And for those of you who are familiar, he is the Singer's Prayer Book. He was the one who translated it, collated it. He actually came from Hungarian heritage. His parents, he was born in London, but his parents sent him back to Hungary for education. and the family, he had a sort of slightly difficult time, so he was reliant on scholarships and giving lessons to others in order to sort of make his way. He was highly educated. He spoke French and Italian and knew Latin and German. And he was considered to be very brilliant. He actually also had two communities. He was the rabbi of the Borough Synagogue, and that was serving a relatively, it was a relatively poor community at the time. That was his first pulpit. And his second pulpit was as minister of the St. Petersburg Place Synagogue, New West End, which was serving a very, one of the wealthiest communities of the time. But he was very open-minded. He did a lot of work with the liberal and reform movements. He preached a sermon at the Manchester Reform Synagogue at one time, and he was considered a great progressive. And as I say, we still use this within Orthodox circles and others. We still use the prayer book that he created, and that's you can see on the corner there, on the right-hand corner, his grave, and then an extract from the prayer book. This man is Samuel Moses. He's interesting because he's interesting for lots of reasons, but he's particularly interesting because he's actually the first person who was buried in the synagogue, in the cemetery, sorry. He, I don't know if you can see on his grave, but if you look, it was a custom to put people's addresses onto to where they lived, onto their stones. It's not something we do today. And it does say he was of London and of Boa Vista, Australia, because his family traded in wool, and he lived part of the time in Australia. In fact, he founded the Hobart Synagogue in Tasmania. But he, when he died, he'd been involved in the cemetery opening, and he wanted to be buried at Willesden Cemetery. There was a slight problem in that the cemetery had not been consecrated yet. So it was very conveniently sorted out. They asked Chief Rabbi Adler to come and consecrate the ground in the morning, and they buried him in the afternoon. And he is buried on that that pathway of trees that I showed you at the beginning, and he is the first person who was laid to rest in Willesden Jewish Cemetery, and that's also a portrait of him there with his family. This is Lionel de Rothschild, obviously a member of the family, of the famous well-known banking family. He is the eldest son of Nathan Mayer, who came to London to found the London branch of the banking family, of the banking dynasty. And the picture you see at the top of the screen is Lionel de Rothschild being introduced to Parliament as the first Jewish MP. But of course, there's more to the story, because it's the story of Jewish emancipation and the right of Jewish people to become members of Parliament. Lionel de Rothschild was an Orthodox practicing Jew and was keen for Jews to be able to participate fully in English life. And he decided he wanted to be a member of Parliament. He was elected in 1847, but he wasn't able to take his seat for another 11 years because there was a complication. And the complication was that to take a seat in Parliament, you had to swear an oath of allegiance, and the oath of allegiance required you to swear on the true faith of a Christian. And this was something that he couldn't do as an Orthodox Jew. And so there then followed a toing and froing, is the best way to describe it, whilst it went between the House of Commons to the House of Lords and back and forth to try and resolve how, mainly because the House of Lords were meddling in the affairs of the House of Commons, so things don't really change, but mainly to get away that this oath of allegiance could be made suitable for him. And eventually something called the Jewish Relief Act was passed, which allowed the House of Commons to sort of write their own script, if you like, for the oath of allegiance, and he was able, 11 years after being first elected, he was able to take his seat. The description is that he took his seat with his wife Charlotte, who happened to be his first cousin as well, which was obviously very typical of the Rothschilds at the time, marrying within the family, watching him in the gallery. And he became the first Jewish MP, swearing, and without having to swear this, on the true faith of a Christian. And at the bottom of the slide, you can see, this is where he's buried. He's buried alongside his wife and some of their children. This is one of the enclosures. So through the cemetery, there are various areas where there will be family plots, where families will have bought sectioned off an area of the land, and it will be reserved for their family members. And what's happened over the years is that some of these plots are full and some of them are not, because families have moved on. Some families, descendants don't want to be buried in Willesden, or maybe are no longer connected with the Jewish community. So there will be certain family plots which have far less members than perhaps was originally intended. There are actually, this is one Rothschild plot in Willesden. There are a number of other plots as well. And there are about, I think, more than 20 different Rothschild family members who are buried in Willesden Jewish Cemetery. Immediately opposite, this is where Lionel Rothschild is, and immediately opposite is actually where one of his sons is buried, who was the first Lord Rothschild. So he was the first Jewish MP, and his son became the first Jewish lord to get a peerage. So I'm just going to take a breath and move on to just show you this other slide, which is just really to show you a few more of the Rothschilds who are buried in the cemetery. And that's the first Lord Rothschild who I just mentioned. That's a picture of Hannah Rosebery, who I mentioned before. High Street giants. So those of you familiar with the British High Street will possibly recognise some of these names. I hope you will. Kurt Geiger, Harriet H. Samuel, it stands for Harriet Samuel, of the jewelry retailers, and Jack Cohen of Tesco's. And I'm going to just start with talking about Jack Cohen, who was born to a family who came from Poland. He was born in the East End of London in 1898. He was, many people said he was a very lucky man. He survived, his troop ship during the First World War was sunk, but he was a survivor when the boat was sunk. He was invalid out of the army in the First World War, having contracted malaria, but he had been in the Royal Flying Corps during the First World War, and had seen service in France, Egypt, and Palestine. At the end of the First World War, as was the way with all soldiers, he had received demob money of £30, and he went out and bought army surplus with it. And the famous expression that's associated with Tesco and with him is that he piled it high and sold it cheap. And that's what he did. He started off in markets, selling these ex-army surplus food items that he'd bought, and he worked in markets in Hackney and Croydon, and was very successful. In 1924, he created the brand that we know as Tesco. The TES, people always, there's all sorts of stories about where this came from, but it came from TES Stockwell, who was his tea supplier, and the CO came from his name, Cohen, and that's how we get to Tesco. And by 1935, they had 100 shops. If you're in London, you may know that his first shop he opened in Burnt Oak, but there were 100 shops by 1939. And he was a great innovator and brought new ideas into the supermarket world in this country and beyond. He introduced rationing before the government did at the start of the Second World War. He went to America after the war and saw self-service shops and brought that idea to this country in the 50s and opened the first supermarkets that were self-service. He introduced the first loyalty scheme in the form of Green Shield stamps, which you collected and then took your Green Shield stamps and exchanged them for useful items. He took on the government with the retail prices index to challenge the cost of food. There's a lovely story that at the end of his life, just literally before he passed away, he was taken by the then chairman of Tesco to see the very first hypermarket that had been opened in 1979. So it was a long way from his market stall in Hackney. So he is buried with his wife, Lady Sarah Cohen. He was knighted by the Queen in the 60s. He's buried in Willesden, and they were both very philanthropic as well. So it's something slightly different. This is Harriet Samuel. Harriet Samuel was born in Great Yarmouth, and she and two of her sisters married three brothers whose family were in the watch and clock making business. Harriet's own husband passed away relatively young, and so she sort of took over the business from her father-in-law. And she was a great, she was also a great innovator, because she began selling jewellery through mail order. Now, this was very much helped by the fact that the railways were developing in the second half of the 19th century, as was the postal service. And she sold jewellery through mail order. One of her sons set up in the north of England the first shops, the H. Samuel shops, which we still just about see on the high street today, and created this very successful jewellery business. I showed you at the start earlier on the family. I hope you see my cursor now. I'm just pointing it out. The family memorial, and this is a very good example of it's a very classical design. It looks like a Greek temple. It's it was built in Portland stone, and it's, I mean, with my fellow guides, we always refer it to as one of the most blingy of the memorials in Willesden Cemetery, which I suppose is fitting for a family that were in the jewellery business. But it's a very grand family memorial. And the next the last of the high street giants for the purposes of today is Kurt Geiger, the shoe empire. Kurt Geiger was born in Vienna. He actually studied medicine, but in 1938 he had to leave Vienna, and together with his wife Olga, they moved to Melbourne. His parents and sisters were killed by the Nazis and obviously didn't survive. Arriving in Australia, he couldn't afford to carry on with his medical studies, so he opened a small shop selling handbags. And it began to be it was very successful. So he then started selling shoes as well. And in the years after the Second World War ended, he traveled and learned more about the manufacturing of shoes and trading in shoes. And he went back to Australia having sort of this extra knowledge. He then eventually in 1960 sold out his business there and came to England and opened his first shop in New Bond Street. By then, his first wife had come to London but went back to Australia and subsequently died there. He married for a second time, and he died in London in 1972 and is buried in Willesden Cemetery. He is described as being a man, as you can imagine, for a man who had a business in the shoe and handbag business that he was so successful in, as a man of good taste and immaculate grooming. Just three retailers who are buried in Willesden. This is Raphael Tuck, who was born in Prussia. He was an Orthodox scholar. He wasn't actually an artist, but he had knowledge of graphic design. And he arrived in 1865 in London with his wife and children. And they started a business selling picture frames in Bishopsgate in the City of London area. And eventually from that went into develop their business and went into printing and engraving. And as you can see from the slide, Christmas card, commercial Christmas cards. Christmas cards were not, around the 1840s, the first Christmas cards really became popular. And he, in 1871, Raphael Tuck printed their first Christmas card, and they were quite clever at marketing. So they ran competitions for people to design them, which you can see in that slide, at the part of the slide there. And his sons went into the business with him, and they were quite competitive as well. And they became very, very successful in printing and selling cards, but also postcards. And actually, rather like with Harriet Samuel, they benefited from the expansion of the postal system. And in 1883, Queen Victoria granted them a royal warrant. So Raphael Tuck, together with his sons Adolf Tuck and Raphael Tuck, are all buried in Willesden Cemetery. On to Eliza. She's one of my favourite people who are resident in Willesden. Now, Eliza Davis was, if I tell you she brings Charles Dickens into the cemetery, you might be a little bit surprised, but let me tell you why. She was born in Jamaica. We don't know a huge amount about her early life, but we know that her grandfather was a cantor there. She married a cousin called James Davis, and they settled in London. And in 1859, they contracted to buy from Charles Dickens his house in Tavistock Square. Charles Dickens was going through a troubled time in his own personal life. He was separated from his wife. He was infatuated with a young actress, and he was selling his house. And he wrote, this is Charles Dickens writing, he wrote, "The purchasers of Tavistock House will be a Jew moneylender. I shall never believe in him until he has paid the money." So that was a slightly disparaging way of writing about Eliza and her husband. Actually, James Davis wasn't a moneylender. He was a solicitor with an office in Bond Street. And we know that the transaction went through, and Charles Dickens then wrote, "I've never had any money transaction with anyone more promptly, fairly and considerately conducted than the sale of Tavistock House." So he'd revised his opinion of Eliza and James. But the story doesn't end there, because Eliza begins to correspond with Dickens. And a few years later, she's doing some fundraising she's involved in charitable works, and she's doing some fundraising for a Jewish convalescent home. And she writes to Dickens to ask him to contribute to this fund. And they start a correspondence, which is one of the longest private correspondences that Dickens had with anybody outside of his own immediate circle. And she doesn't mince her words with him. She tells him that he has encouraged prejudice against Jews. And she starts to take him to task in writing to him. And in particular, she highlights Fagin, the famous character from Oliver Twist. And she makes the point that in the original versions of Oliver Twist, Fagin is referred to 257 times as the Jew and only 42 times as the old man. And Eliza really has a go at him about this and compares him, which Dickens doesn't like. She compares him to other Victorian novelists such as Walter Scott and Wilkie Collins, and she says that they would never write about Jews in this way. So the following year, after this correspondence, Dickens is writing what is going to be his last work, and that's Our Mutual Friend. And he's obviously thought about this because he introduces into Our Mutual Friend, and some of you may be familiar with this, the character of a pious Jew called Mr. Rear, who's referred to as one of the characters refers to in the context of Jewish people. I think there cannot be kinder people in the world. And Eliza recognizes this and says to Dickens, thank you, and she sends him a Bible as a gift, and she writes in the Bible, and I'll just read this quote because I rather like it: in grateful and admiring recognition of having exercised the noblest quality man can possess, that of atoning for an injury as soon as conscious of having inflicted it. So he sort of redeemed himself in her eyes. And the very final thing is that in the last revisions that Dickens makes to Oliver Twist before he dies, he changes the references to Fagin as the Jew all the way through the book, and changes it to references to the old man rather than the Jew. And the final revision of Oliver Twist is very different from the original version. So this is Eliza, and she's a really, really interesting woman who I particularly like very much. I'm slightly conscious of time, but let me just quickly introduce you to Horace Golding, who some of you may have heard of. He was known as the whirlwind illusionist. He was born in Vilna in Lithuania. He was called Hyman Elias Goldstein, and he basically started a magic act based around these magic performances with using illusion as the highlight of it. He was very well known, very successful. He came to London in 1901 and performed here. He also performed for Edward VII. He then had a bit of misfortune and lost the money he'd made out of his performance when he was on a ship that sank with all his money on it. But that didn't stop him starting all over again. And he started again with this trick at the bottom, which is sawing a woman in half. And he created a whole sort of scene around it. So when he was doing this trick, he'd have ambulances on standby, and he was often suing other people for trying to copy his trick and making out that it was his own invention. No one else did this trick, although it was probably being done by others at the time. He made a lot of money, but he spent a lot of money defending his right to perform this particular trick. He became a British citizen, and his very last trick was at the Wood Green Empire in 1939, which was the trick known as catching a bullet. He did this trick, came home and died peacefully in his sleep. And the grave you can see in the top right-hand corner was in pretty poor state, but the Magic Circle learnt about it, and through some people who actually had family members buried next to Horace Golding, the grave was restored, and the plaque at the front recognises the Magic Circle members helped to restore Horace's grave. And now we come to Rosalind Franklin, who I imagine quite a lot of you are familiar with. She on her grave, which as I said before, is a listed grave and is probably the most visited grave in the whole of Willesden Cemetery. Her grave actually says on it, her research and discoveries on viruses remain of lasting benefit to mankind, but it's often for her work on DNA that people immediately think about her and refer to her. She came from a very well-known and prominent Jewish family. She was an extremely able and clever girl. An aunt described her age 6 as being alarmingly clever. She studied for her science degree, natural science degree at Cambridge, at Newnham College, Cambridge, before the Second World War. And she went to Paris to do a PhD on coal, actually, but also she learnt in Paris the techniques of X-ray crystallography, which was to prove very important skill and technique. And she came back to London after the war, and London was a fairly sort of dull and miserable in those years. And she took up a research position at King's College London, which was was not a particularly good place for a woman to be. It was things like the common room, women weren't allowed to go in there to eat lunch, and there was a sort of a limited amount of hostility in that atmosphere. And her colleague was somebody called Maurice Wilkins, who I think the understanding is that they didn't get on particularly well. She has unfairly, and we know this from family members, in the book that was written by Watson in 1968, The Double Helix, he portrayed her in a rather unfair way. She's described as her family, by family members, as being great fun, a really good company, really good aunt to her sister's children. But just going back to her time at King's, it was whilst at King's she looked at the very famous photograph that's known as photograph 51, which is the photograph of the double helix, and that's the picture in the top left here. And this is the double helix, which is the unlocking of the mystery of DNA. And Wilkins, who was her colleague, unbeknown to her, she knew she'd found something very important when she found this, but she was still carrying on her work. And unbeknown to her, Wilkins let Watson and Crick, who were working in Cambridge on their own attempts to unlock DNA, see this picture, and this really basically helped them with their research. And it was a slightly unfair thing to do, because she was still finalizing her own work. Watson and Crick were awarded the Nobel Prize for their work on DNA. It was by then too late, because unfortunately Rosalind had died in 1958. She developed ovarian cancer, and she died before there was really a chance for the work that she had done to be fully recognized. And
oh, bloody hellfire.
Hello? Did I okay? Are we okay? Are we okay? She wasn't really recognized in the way until much later on, and last year was her centenary, and certainly through the 60s and through the 80s, in a lot of people, particularly in the feminist movement, made her as a symbol of the sort of women's world, women's rights in the world of science. Her sister said that she would have hated the description of her being a sort of downtrodden woman scientist. She was a very good scientist and a very ambitious scientist, but she was portrayed somewhat unfairly by Watson and Crick, and certainly they didn't recognize her in the way that they should have done. But it's her parents, when they put the wording on her tombstone, they will recognize her later work, which is the work she was doing just in time before she died, on viruses, which is of course something that's continues to be so important to us today. And I'm going to, because I'm very conscious of the time, I'm just going to skip through. This is the Mark Gertler, the artist and conscientious objector. This is, he is buried at the back of Willesden Cemetery, very near to the wall with the liberal, where the wall to the liberal Jewish cemetery is. He was a conscientious objector. He, the most famous painting of his is that picture there of the merry-go-round, which depicts the futility of war. he had a troubled life, and towards the end of his life, he had TB. He wasn't particularly, although he'd been a scholar at the Slade School of Art in London, he had not been so particularly successful in exhibiting his and selling his work, and he took his own life in June of 1939, at a time when he was sort of depressed from his ill health and the inability to sell his work. That's a picture of him on the top right, and his grave, which actually has been recently restored, is at the back of, as I said, at the back of Willesden Cemetery. And my final slide is, or not my final slide, my final resident to talk to you about is Redcliffe Salomon, who we affectionately call Potato Man. Redcliffe Salomon was a doctor originally. He also developed TB, and as a result, he had to give up his career as a doctor and instead moved into the world of genetics, which was a relatively new science at the time. And he had moved out to Hertfordshire, and he started investigating viruses in potatoes. This was something that people were very aware of. The Irish potato famine had been very much in people's consciousness during the 19th century, the mid-19th century, when more than 1 million people had died as a result of the potato famine. And Redcliffe Salomon knew about this, and he started cross-fertilizing wild and domestic versions of potatoes in order to get rid of this virus, and he was most successful. He became incredibly interested in the potato, and strange though this may sound, he wrote a book called The History and Social Influence of the Potato, which he wrote in 1949, and you can still buy it on Amazon today for £38.90 or something like that. It's the seminal work on the potato and everything to do with potatoes. So anytime you have a packet of crisps or plate of chips, think about Redcliffe Salomon and the work he did on the potato and getting rid of the virus. Redcliffe was, his first wife was Nina Salomon, who herself was a very well-known Jewish scholar, and he particularly translator of some of the Jewish texts into English. And Redcliffe and Nina had a number of children, and many of their descendants are scientists and in the arts and very well known today. So that's Redcliffe. That's a very whistle-stop tour through his life. There's a lot more than I've told you in that moment, but you can see on the top of the slide there the book that I've just referred to. And finally, I talked about some of the projects at the beginning that are going on at the cemetery to encourage people to visit. And there's been a lot of work done to replant and rewild and to encourage wild flowers and insects to be in the cemetery grounds. And in some situations, particularly where there have been family plots where people know there's one particular area where the family have been traced, so that's obviously of interest to members of society. Family have been traced, and they're happy. They know they're not going to use the burial grounds for any subsequent members of the family, so they've allowed rewilding and flowers to be planted on the area of land. So the cemetery now is being sort of brought back to some of its garden characteristics from the early years. There's a visitor centre. That's a picture of the visitor centre, as I mentioned, and you can do research there. There's a website which has got lots of updates and information, and there's a newsletter, and you can join and receive copies of the newsletter, and people are welcome to come along and find out about their own family histories. There is also, just at the end here, some reference material on the Willesden Jewish community, which was very prominent during the 30s, 40s, 50s and beyond. And there is now, as I said at the beginning, a resurgence. So at that point, I'm going to, there's the link to the cemetery website. I'm going to stop there, and I hope there might be some questions.
Thank you, Liz. And just before we get to questions, I'm going to call for a huge round of applause for that talk. Thank you, Liz. So if anyone would like to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hand. Just change it so we can see each other.
Yeah,
and
the cemetery was funded.
yeah,
how do you want to do it, Lee? You're going to call on.
Okay, I'll call out names. So
Okay.
Gina, if I could ask you to unmute. Gina Marks. Oop. There we go.
It's done it now, thank you. Thanks for a very interesting talk, Liz. I was on the visit.
Oh, great.
Okay. Visit a while ago. Interested to hear about the lesser known people.
Yes.
And while we all, probably know some of those famous names, the majority of us in the Genealogy Society are actually looking for our lesser known ancestors and family members who are not so easy to find, particularly in section B, I think is section B. They're virtually impossible to find. When will things be made easier for us to actually find the location?
Okay, that's a very good question.
Yeah.
That's a very good question, because as volunteer guides, it was very hard for us to find even some of the more prominent people. But what's happened is that the so as a result of the grant, there's now signage, and one thing that has definitely improved is that all the various sections which have a letter attached to them are all now clearly signed. So if you were to come along looking for block X, let's say, you would easily find block X because the signage is hugely improved. As you rightly say, not everybody there is, well, everybody's there of interest to somebody in some way. There are about 27,000, more than 27,000 graves, and I didn't actually say this, some of the graves are not in such good state. It's the responsibility of families to look after the graves, not the responsibility of the individual families, not the responsibility of the cemetery body. So clearly some are in not such good condition. There's a very good, on the United Synagogue website, you can, if you know the name of your family member and you think they were buried at Willesden, and if you have the date, the year that they, not the date, the year they died, then you can search it. And I mean, I've been doing this on a personal level recently, and we managed to find some kind of great grandparents in my husband's family. So you can find it. It's not, I know, I understand what you're saying. It's not the easiest of tasks, but it is much clearer these days.
Yes, but even when you've got the plot number, which I had,
yes,
I still was not able to find that actual position in that section. Section B is the worst.
If you're able to come to the visitor centre, I don't know where you're based, but if you're able, there are people who can help you find them now, and it has improved. I may not be perfect, but it's definitely improved. I'd give it a try. I'd give it a try if you can come down.
I will try and get back, because in searching for this one, all I succeeded in doing was falling down a foxhole.
Oh, I know. And some of the, and actually you have to be really careful, because there's some very wobbly stones. You have to be really careful.
It needs a health warning.
Yeah, absolutely. Wear comfortable shoes as well if you're coming.
Okay, well, I'll try and pay another visit.
Try and come. Sorry, on the website there's details of the opening hours of the visitor centre, because although the cemetery's open most of the day, the visitor centre isn't open all the time, so check it before you come.
And the other thing that was interesting, I wasn't aware that there was a gate through into the Liberal cemetery.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks Gina and Liz for answering. If we can go to Laura Convisa next.
Yeah, hi.
Hello.
That was really interesting. Thank you very much. I just wondered about the grade 2 listings. Why were those few graves listed as grade 2 and not maybe older ones?
I don't know enough about how grade 2, how listings are done.
I don't know either.
certainly the Burne-Jones. So this is actually quite funny because we did a kind of reciprocal visit. We went to West Brompton, which is one of the garden cemeteries, and they very proudly said, and we've got the only Burne-Jones inscription on a grave, and we said, actually there's one in Willesden. So I think the Burne-Jones is listed because of the prominence of the artist.
And Rosalind Franklin, because hers is relatively new compared to some.
Yes, I think that's the listing because of the importance of her. Right. I don't know exactly. I think you can on the where the listings are done, you can read why it was given. Okay. And the Hannah Rosebery, I think because of the architectural interest of it. I'm not 100% certain, but you could probably look it up.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks. If we can go to Bernard, if you can unmute yourself, Bernard, but I need to restrict you to one question, if I may.
Gosh, one question. Well, thank you for a fantastic talk, and thank you for mentioning the Liberal Cemetery, because I'd spent the morning trying to locate my grandmother in that cemetery. But it's actually not a question, it's a suggestion, and it's to do with the searching. Thanks to Lee, I discovered that if you don't have full information, or if there's been a mistake in transcription, when you do the search, you can just put in the first letter of a name, and it brings up a lot of options. And I found that very valuable. That's on the United Synagogue site when I was looking for marriage authorizations, and today when I was looking for burial sites. I'm not going to ask another question because I could go on forever, but it was a fantastic talk. But I just wanted to throw in that Rosalind Franklin was related to Eliza Davis, and you had them juxtaposed.
Right. Yes, that's right. They were, yeah. But a lot, I should say that a lot of the people in the cemetery are related to,
Absolutely.
Yeah, and there's a lot of connections. And also, as far as what's known as the cousinhood is concerned, there's huge connections. Yeah, that's a whole separate talk for another time.
Oh, yes, please.
Thanks, Bernard. And if we can go to Joy Kestenbaum next. Joy?
Oh, hi. Thank you. I could have listened to you all day looking at all the graves. I visited, and I mentioned it before the talk that I visited in 2015. I live in New York, and I walked around for several hours, and some of the ones you showed I did not see, so that was great. I have one question about calling this a garden cemetery. I've studied a lot of cemeteries, and of course it's there's a lot of plantings, etc. But it was my impression that a real garden cemetery has curved pathways, and this one looks very rectilinear. So that was one question, that if it's considered like the 8th garden cemetery. I was wondering if the other garden cemeteries in London have more of the curvy linear park-like paths. And yeah, it is interesting in visiting, because I went to Rosalind Franklin's to then look around and see the graves next to her where all her relatives are buried, and seeing the connections. So anyway, the story about the Dickens was quite interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. I just think about the garden cemetery aspect. One thing about Willesden is that there was more, as the need became more, the gardens, some of the parts that were more garden were taken over for burials. So it lost some of its garden aspects, if you like. Certainly at Highgate, which I'm familiar with, there are curved paths. It is quite linear, but I think it might be because part of the gardens were taken over for burials as they needed the space. But there's quite a lot of work. If you go at the spring this year, the spring where the rewilding was done, it was really pretty. There were loads of flowers out and butterflies, and it was very, very beautiful.
Great, thanks for that. And I think we'll go to Colin Cohen next, if we may.
This is about somebody who isn't buried at the cemetery. You mentioned Redcliffe Salomon, my great uncle,
Oh, okay.
and all of his dozen or so children were brought up by a woman, I can't remember her first name, surname was Hewitt, who was Grand Nurse Hewitt. And she wasn't Jewish, but she taught all the children their Jewish prayers, and she would never dream of eating bacon. And when before she died, she said she wanted to be buried in Willesden. And Redcliffe knew the chief rabbi very well, but he was completely unbending, so I don't know where she's buried. But intriguingly, you mentioned before the talk started, the second Adler is buried in the same tomb with his wife. And thanks to what you told me before the talk, I found the grave of her brother, my great-grandfather, who was the architect of the prayer house. But the intriguing thing is that at some stage, although he was best friends with the Adlers, they were at the Jewish Free School together and at Jews College together, at some stage there must have been a theological break, because Nathan Joseph seems to have been one of the founders of the Reform movement. And his son Ernest, my grandfather, was then became the architect to the Reform movement. So the former synagogue at St. John's Wood, for instance, was designed by the son of the architect of so many of the Orthodox synagogues, like St. Petersburg Place.
All right. Okay, that's very interesting.
It all sort of interconnects.
Yeah. But in that area where Redcliffe Salomon is buried, his parents are buried. I mean, his father, Redcliffe Salomon's parents, his father was dealt in ostrich feathers. He was dealt in plumes, and that's a family plot. And there's a number of family members then of your family who are all buried there, including
we restored Maya and Sarah's graves.
Yes,
including. If you hang on a second, I will show you a remarkable portrait.
Can I also, whilst you're doing that, just tell everybody else that there's one of Redcliffe's brothers was called Willesden Salomon, and maybe Colin can tell us if he was named after the station.
I don't know if you can see this, but this is Maya as a young man, and it's only a copy. I don't know who has the original. I have 60 second cousins on this side of the family, but this was drawn by his first cousin, Rebecca Solomon, who was the brother of Simeon Solomon.
Yeah, who I didn't even get onto.
Who didn't get a pre-Raphaelite grave, and whose grave was also recently restored.
Yeah.
But if anyone knows who has the original of this, none of the scholars of the pre-Raphaelites know anything about this particular painting, except through half a dozen copies of it which exist in the family. But there's one of my cousins is obviously keeping very mum about having the original, because Rebecca's work is extremely rare,
right,
and very little known.
Right, and also
Simeon's is very well known.
You probably also know that in the Jewish Museum is the portrait of Nina Salomon.
Yes, and now recently alongside it, Redcliffe.
Right.
That's been hung in the last, one of my cousins has presented that by Rothenstein. And it's on the staircase alongside Nina.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Colin. Anyone else have a question? Susie, I noticed you came off mute. Did you have a question? No? Susie Fox? No? Okay.
Can you hear me or not?
Yeah, go ahead.
You can hear me, because I can't see anything at the moment. My whole screen's gone blank. I can still hear what's going on.
Oh, okay.
If I'm visible and you can hear me, I have got one question. I thought it was a fantastic talk. I've got a list of huge numbers of my relatives who are buried there. There were just a few, and I think the website's great for finding them. There are just a few slightly where the transcription's gone a bit wrong, and I was wondering who I can ask to correct them. I mean, names got and a date and things.
Do you mean on the website?
Yes. I think it's brilliant. It's just that the names are, you know, there are a couple of names which makes it hard to find, and a date and things which just
this is on the United Synagogue Find a Grave?
Yes.
I would think that probably if you could address the inquiry to the Burial Society of the United Synagogue, I think that's probably the best starting point. I'm not 100% sure.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Susie. Any other questions for Liz? Do feel free to raise your electronic or physical hand. I think I see Hazel Dakers through some mist, but if you can unmute, Hazel, please go ahead.
I thoroughly enjoyed the talk. I haven't been there for some years, but I did go a couple of times when I was starting out on my research. Thank you, Liz. When we had a talk a few years ago from the project manager of the funded project at the cemetery, there was a suggestion that once everything was up and running, they might like to have for a database details of the families whom we have researched.
Okay.
Is there such a thing?
I'm sure. I mean, I don't know. Did Hester come and talk to you?
I'm sorry, I can't remember the name.
Right.
It was Hester.
It was Hester. I don't know, but that's something we can talk about afterwards. I'm sure. I mean, any work that's been done, it would be a shame to lose it. And you don't want to reinvent the wheel. And if people have done lots of helpful research, then it would be worth bringing it together. Certainly, if we can kind of continue that conversation.
Well, I should think an awful lot of us at least have grandparents who are there. And I know that I've got a number of others, and it's been clear from other speakers. We're all researching these people.
Yes. Yes. No, it would be really worth pursuing. I've made a note.
Thank you.
All right. Question from Anthony Scott Norman.
I am now. Okay. Lovely guided talk, Liz. And I know the cemetery extremely well, and I share Gina's concerns about the lack of mapping. What I wanted to talk about was not a family connection directly, but a friend of the family connection. And I'm on Rayful Tuck and the greeting card family. Are you aware that one of his descendants, who was in the greeting card business, who was a contemporary of my father's, Rayful Tuck, was Labour MP for Watford. I don't know when he died, but I remember meeting Rayful at my father's 70th birthday in 1976, and he was a lovely guy, and he was a very good family friend.
Okay, all right.
I'm sure it was the same Tuck family.
Okay, I don't. That's interesting. I mean, the original Rayful Tuck is buried there along with the sons.
I don't know where Rayful Tuck MP was.
Buried, okay.
I will check him out on the website.
Definitely. Thank you for that.
Okay. Thanks, Anthony. Next question is from Catherine Kopisarov. Hopefully I pronounced your surname correctly, Catherine.
Almost. Kopisaro. I'm sorry you can't see me. It's I've got computer problems. That was a very interesting talk. Thank you, Liz. I actually went to Willesden in the last few months.
Oh, right.
Haven't been for many years. A huge number of my family members are buried there, and mostly part of the famous cousinhood.
Right.
There are two. One issue Gina has sort of raised actually is, even if you know the plot number and everything else, couldn't find Horatio Meyer, with the most amazing name, who is buried there, who was quite a well-known businessman. But more importantly is, if the Find a Grave doesn't carry my great-great-great-grandfather, who was Louis Cohen, who's featured under the Jewish Museum's Jewish Lives Matter.
Yes.
Can't find any records for his burial, which is really weird. His parents were at Brady Street, and all his millions of sons and all the other Cohens are all at Willesden. And I don't quite know how to go about, it may be more of a genealogical question than a Willesden question.
Is it, but I think he is there. He's a founder of the United Synagogue, isn't he? He's one of the original founders. Yeah, I think he is.
Died in 1882.
I'm pretty sure he is there, and I'm pretty sure we have, because when we did the original work on the founders of the United Synagogue, this is off the top of my head, but I think we did do work on him, and I think he's there. What I would consider, can I suggest, which is that if you can get to Willesden when the visitor centre is open, then there's more chance of being able to do some research on site and talk to people there. And I know I said this before, but the signage has improved. It's not, there are some blocks which are very big, and I think that's what was being said earlier. Some of the individual blocks are large, but if you know the row number, I mean, I just really did this only 2 weeks ago, looking from, as I say, from my husband's great-great-grandfather, who I found. I counted the rows. You can count the rows through, and you should be able to find people as long as you've got the row number correctly.
Yes, I could certainly do that.
It does take a bit of, a little bit of sort of just counting and walking slowly, and you sort of have to just watch your step, and some of the rows are quite long, so you do have to walk along a long row, and in those bigger blocks. Certainly the front lawn is easier. The front lawn is much easier. The front lawn is, and particularly people have got relatives who are buried more in the sort of 50s and 60s and later on, the front row. So that slide I showed you of Jack Cohen, he's on the front row, and actually Rosalind Franklin's on the front lawn rather. That area is easier. It's the back right-hand sections, if you're familiar with it, that's quite difficult, can be quite difficult.
Yes, well, some of the descendants are up there. I didn't find a problem with that, but Louis Cohen himself, when I went there, there were some people, volunteers, and somebody behind the scenes in the office who helped, and you looked him up and couldn't find any record.
Okay, there are some people who sort of amongst the volunteers who, if you want to sort of privately message the office, some of the volunteers are, can specific or more, maybe more depth, and you can. I'd send a message in and see if somebody can help you.
Okay.
I'm just trying to look at my notes. I'm talking to you and I can't. I'm pretty sure I had something on it.
Of who to write to, you mean?
Oh, right. Well, send it to the Willesden. Look on the website for the email address.
Yes. Okay.
Do it like that.
Yes. Thank you.
Or you can privately message me afterwards.
That's really kind. Sorry to be a nuisance.
No, that's okay.
Okay, thanks for that, Catherine. I think we'll go to Anita because she hasn't asked a question yet. And then I do see two others, but we are running tight on time. So Anita.
Okay, I just wanted to sort of reiterate that some of the stones might not be there, or they're in such bad condition. They've weathered, they've been smashed, that you just might not be able to find your relative in Willesden. They might be buried there, but the grave is just in such a poor condition. And I think people go there expecting everything to be sort of shiny and bright, and that's not the case. Unless the family has actually restored the graves, or the grave is in good condition, it is what it is, like in any other cemetery.
Yes, I know. That can be quite frustrating.
Okay, thanks for that, Anita. So Liz, are you okay for two more questions?
Two more, if that's okay.
Okay, we'll just do two more then. So first is from Joy Kestenbaum, and then second we'll go to Susie Fox again. Joy?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, even though I also do have relatives buried there, we talked about that before, and they're in good condition, the graves. But I was wondering, since I am from New York, and I was not only interested in going there to see my relative's grave, but as a tourist to look at some of these famous people's graves, and people who I knew about that may not have been the most famous. I was just wondering if there are future plans in having a map that notes where the different some of the major graves are. When I went to Rosalind Franklin, I was particularly also interested in seeing Lord and Lady Herbert Samuel's grave.
Yeah.
My mother met him during World War II. She was a US Army nurse in England, in Oxford and London during World War II. And she was invited to a Passover Seder at the home of Cecil Roth, and Lord and Lady Herbert Samuels were there. So she described this fascinating multi-hour long Passover Seder to me. So I was also very interested in seeing.
So there is a map. There is now a map. Yes, and in fact, if you go on the Willesden's website, on the cemetery website, the map is reproduced there, and that's got the notables. I haven't got the link to it now, but the notables who you referred to are shown on the map. So you couldn't. Because although we have, and I should say this, that everybody is welcome. There are guided tours. And you can sign up for them on the United Synagogue website for those of you who are in the,
And what are the regular hours of the cemetery?
Well, the cemetery is open Monday to Friday, different times of closing times on Friday. It's obviously closed on Saturday and it's open on Sundays, but the visitor centre is open only certain of those hours during the day. It's all on the website, but the map is there on the website, and there's quite a lot of information on the website about notables as well. And people can self-guide, and the various interpretation boards around the cemetery now do give information, and certainly about some of the prominent people who are there. And there are, there's lots of great and good people. There's a few ne'er-do-wells as well, but that's another time as well.
Thank you.
I think it's the last question, Lee.
Yeah, final question. Susie, can you unmute yourself? Oh dear, I think Susie's lost control of the computer. Okay, I did try and send you the ability to do that, but Susie's holding up a picture. I think we're going to struggle with that one.
Just technical issues, it sounds like.
Yeah. Okay. In which case, I'd just like to draw your attention to the link that Colin just put in the chat, which is the map from Willesden Cemetery. So in which case, I'd just like to ask for another huge round of applause for Liz for her wonderful talk and for answering all our questions. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you very much. And good luck with all your endeavours, all of you. I hope you will find all the answers.
Thanks very much, Liz.
Thank you very much.
There is also, if anyone's hanging around after this, I did also put the link in the chat to the United Synagogue Burial Society search site that several people have mentioned, including Liz. You can look up your ancestors on there using the tip that Bernard provided, even just using a single letter.
Okay.
Okay, everyone.
Thank you very much. I'm going to leave you. Your meeting's carrying on, is that right?
No, we're going to close the meeting as well. But so thank you again to Liz. Thanks everyone, and hope to see you on another JGSGB Zoom really soon. Bye everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.